ค่ะขอต้อนรับทุกท่านกลับเข้าสู่งาน 25 ปี .th ทบทวนอดีตพิจารณาปัจจุบันผลักดันอนาคตค่ะโดยหลังเบรกนี้น่าจะเป็นช่วงที่หลายๆท่านรอคอยกันอยู่นะคะนั่นก็คือปาฐกถาพิเศษโดยประธานกรรมการบริหารองค์กรอินเทอร์เน็ตโลกหรือ ICANN โดยท่านยังเป็นหนึ่งในผู้ให้กำเนิดอินเทอร์เน็ตที่เราใช้งานกันทุกวันนี้ค่ะนอกจากนี้ท่านยังเป็น CEO และผู้ก่อตั้งของบริษัทชินคูโรซึ่งเป็นบริษัทที่ทำการวิจัยและพัฒนาการแลกเปลี่ยนข้อมูลทางอินเทอร์เน็ต Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Crocker to the stage.
Too much light. Well, good morning, everybody. The internet is all about solving different kinds of problems, and one of the problems that I faced here this morning is how to match the many splendid greetings from everybody. And so I thought hard about that, and I realized that it's solving the wrong problem. The internet's about bringing people together, about breaking down barriers, and enlarging our circle of friends. And so in that spirit, I'm going to breach the protocol and become a little less formal here and put on one of these very fine tie t-shirts, .th t-shirts. Yeah, thank you. And if you're so inclined, I got the biggest one. Barely. And let me invite any of you who want to take off your coats to do so. Oh, this is much better. And so I can begin by saying hello and welcome, friends, with no distinctions as to who we are, where we've come from, or how old we are, which is particularly important to me. The jacket had some notes in it. This is a problem. This is a truly wonderful occasion. You've heard the stories about the beginnings of .th, about the origins in the Asia Institute of Technology and its origins back in the Southeast Asia Atlantic Treaty Organization, going back 54 years. Is that right? That's quite a long time. I remember vaguely reading about it in school and not being able to make any sense out of what it really meant. And now, many years later, I see not only what it was intended to do, but the more important things about what actually came forth from all of those initial activities that were born in a troubled time with military implications. And interestingly, the internet has grown out of very similar origins, and so I want to take you back a little bit and discuss that. The period in the early 1960s, with the rise of big computer centers, also brought a understanding that it would be important to connect computers together. Some early experiments were tried. A couple were successful, but on a very small scale. And quite a few were unsuccessful, despite continued efforts. And many of them were not documented or have been lost to history. In the period around 1967, the folks at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and I should say a bit more about the agency, which I will in a minute. We're sponsoring quite a bit of advanced research in computer science. They were sponsoring research in other areas as well, but there was an office within DARPA that was sponsoring computer science research in particular. So DARPA, and it was originally named ARPA, and then it got renamed DARPA, and then it got named back again at ARPA, and then named yet again back to its current state of DARPA. But it really did not change its structure or purpose. The United States was in competition principally with the USSR, with the Soviet Union. And one of the areas of competition was the space program. And when the Sputnik went up, it caught the U.S. by surprise, and it caused a shockwave throughout the U.S. government. Now, the U.S. had been putting quite a bit of energy into its own space program. In fact, in a fashion that is very common in governments, they've been putting a lot of energy in two parts of the government. Both the Army and the Navy had its own space programs, and they were competing with each other, and neither one was succeeding. With the launch of Sputnik by the Russians, the attention came to the very top levels of the U.S. government, and quite a few things happened quickly. And one of them was the formation of a research agency that would be given carte blanche, given complete freedom to identify important problems and to spend money on solving those problems in order to prevent technological surprise. And one of the very first tasks that it took on was taking the elements of the U.S. space program, putting them together and making sense out of them. And out of that, NASA was formed, and also the military side of the space program. So the agency was formed in the late 1950s, and by the early 1960s, it was clear that computers were a very important piece of technology for the military, and that there was much to be done to improve the understanding, and money was put into formulating advanced programs. Time-sharing systems, artificial intelligence, advanced programming languages, new architectures, advanced graphics were some of the major themes of the time. And in the period from the early 1960s through the mid-1960s, research laboratories were funded relatively well to push the boundaries in each of these areas. And so at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and at Carnegie Mellon University and at University of California, Berkeley and at UCLA and at a number of schools and some other nonprofits and occasionally even a profit company around the country, pockets of excellence grew up and became a very rich environment. In parallel with this was this understanding, as I said, that connecting computers together was an important task. There had been some previous experiments that had not worked out very well, and the people in the office had the foresight to say what we need is a stronger effort, and they put some time into thinking through how to do that. They gathered inputs from the community, and out of that was born what was called the ARPANET. It was a first use of packet switching. It was a very deliberate attempt to connect computers of different manufacture, different operating systems, and not incidentally, in different administrative environments with completely different cultures and politics associated with them. As it had turned out, one of the reasons why some of the prior networking experiments had failed turned out to be only partially related to technology, and in many cases strongly related to clashes of culture, clashes of territorial imperative, issues of control, all of the ordinary human things that infect and color all of our behavior in every endeavor. So in the 1967-1968 time frame, the plans were laid for building this ARPANET, and the plan was to build it in the laboratories that already existed, to give it as a kind of a gift or, depending upon your point of view, as an imposition. But in any case, it was a captive audience because all of these places were getting funded from the same office, and they could hardly say no. Some were happy, some less so. And there was an interesting spread, not a very serious one, but it turned out that the folks in the laboratories in the western part of the U.S. were more receptive, and the ones on the eastern tended to be a little less receptive. The story is that the ones on the East Coast were older and had been better endowed, and their view was that if they were connected to a network, other people would be using their resources, and they didn't see a need for that. And the ones in the West were younger and not so much worried about that. By accident of time and place, I happened to be at UCLA, which was designated as the first node for the ARPANET. And another interesting little piece of culture related to this is that the heads of the laboratories at each of these were not very interested themselves in the network for the most part. They each had their own agenda, and they pushed hard on their own research agenda, and so this network was a secondary task, and they delegated it to lower level people, graduate students. My lifelong friend Vint Cerf and I were both graduate students. John Postel, who had gone to the same high school, was another graduate student there. So we were drawn into this initial project of connecting up the first 4 sites around the western part of the United States. A commercial company, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, had won a competitive procurement to build what were called IMPs in those days, for interface message processors, and but what you would now call a router. And the routers were delivered at 1 per month, each one carefully built. And the first node was installed at UCLA in September of 1969. And then in October, November, and December, the second, third, and fourth nodes were installed at the other sites. And the decision was made more or less on the fly, as pretty much had been planned, to keep extending this network to other nodes around the country. And very shortly, we had a cross-country network, and it grew bit by bit. Over the next couple of years, we had several dozen nodes, and we thought that was a phenomenally large, big network. Let me talk about the interplay between technology and organization and social challenges and related sorts of things. One of the problems that we had to face was the very simple one. What are we going to do with this network? The plan had been very carefully thought out about how to build the hardware, what the routers should do, and the plan had nothing at all, in essence, of what we were going to do with this network once it was up and running. We knew that we had to get each of our computers connected to the IMP, which would sit nearby. That was not an easy thing necessarily because there was no standard hardware. Ethernet had not been invented. There were no other standard interfaces on computers. And indeed, computers of the day were built as if they were the center of their own world. They had attachments for peripherals, but the very name peripheral tells you exactly what their status was. There was no standard way to connect 2 computers together, even of the same manufacturer. Bolt, Beranek, and Newman defined a very, very simple, lightweight bit serial interface, and they built half of it out of their side, and they gave us the diagram and said, you have to build your half. And so each of us had to go figure out how to get inside the hardware of the computer and build additional circuitry and introduce that circuitry into the operating system as a new device, and then build software both in the operating system and at the application layer to make all that work. And we had no plans, no blueprint, no structure to do that. And so that engendered the other side of the story that I'm telling here. When it was determined that we were going to have this network, representatives from the first 4 sites came together. We came together in August of 1968. This is a full year before the first node was to be delivered, and in fact was even some months before it was known who was going to build the network, because the competitive procurement was underway, and BBN was one of the bidders, but not the only one, and had not yet been selected. So in a relatively small room, a couple of us from each of the sites showed up to meet each other for the first time, and we recognized that we came with the same set of questions, with comparable backgrounds. We understood a fair amount about operating systems, about programming languages. We were not communications experts per se. We were not electrical engineers by and large. But we understood application, what we would now call application layer things. And we knew that we needed to keep talking to each other. And so we made essentially one critical decision at that first meeting, which was that we would indeed keep talking to each other, and that the way we would do that is we would go visit each other's laboratories and get to know each other better. And at that very instant, there was a complete recognition of the irony of that dialogue. We understood that one of the purposes of the network was to reduce the need for travel. The very first thing we did was increase our travel and start traveling around quite a bit to see each other. And indeed, I got into the middle of it so heavily that the contract that Professor Kleinrock had with DARPA had to be increased solely to support my travel. I don't know whether to be proud or ashamed of that, but I certainly was spending a lot more time on airplanes, and as a side consequence was introduced to my wife in Boston while I was on a business trip, fixed up with her, and here we are 40 years later, and we're still together, so that was a good thing. The business of talking to each other gradually formed into a slightly more formal process. After several months, we said we'd been kicking around some ideas. Some of them were low-level, mundane ideas about how we could set up a circuit, how we could log into each other's machines, how we could move files. But we knew that there was a great deal more that could be done. And we also understood, and here's the absolutely crucial thing, we understood that we did not know, and we were not going to be able to figure out very quickly how to do all these things. And that therefore, the most important thing that we could do was to leave room for others to add to the basics of what we were trying to put together. And so out of those early discussions came 3 kinds of openness. An openness in the architecture so that other things could be added. We very deliberately had in mind that the layers of network protocols should be very thin, that you should be able to pile on top of them, but you should also be able to go around them, underneath them, discard them, build ones that were parallel, and so forth, that the layers should be there as an assistance rather than as a barrier. So that was one very important form of openness. A second very important form of openness was that the discussions that we were having should not be limited to just those of us who happened to be in the room at that time, that forum, that discussion platform, if you will, should be open to others to join us. And out of that, quite straightforward and simple idea, formed what we first called the Network Working Group, and over the years has morphed into today's Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, where the criteria for membership does not exist because there's no such thing as membership. That anybody is welcome to participate. There are no barriers to entry. Anybody can join any of the working groups, be on any mailing list, attend any meeting, and that there's no enfranchisement. And with the lack of enfranchisement, not only is there no way to keep anybody out, but there's no way to hold formal votes. And so a alternate method of reaching decisions, rough consensus and running code, is the slogan that embodies how the IETF works. The other on the list of my 3 areas of openness was a decision that anything that was written would be available to anybody and be free of charge, and that anybody could contribute. So it was intended originally as a very lightweight, temporary arrangement, the creation of what I somewhat humorously called requests for comments. And I expected that when we created this series in April of 1969, that by the time we started to have the network in operation, that they'd be replaced with a formal manual of how the thing worked, and that these notes would be discarded. One of the miscalculations, if you will, was watching the request for comment series thrive and persist, and now it's impossible to get rid of them. Some people would like to. They've changed over the years, but much more importantly, they've become a meme, an idea embodied in their own right, with the term copied in other environments. And to my great astonishment, the term request for comments is now in the Oxford English Dictionary. So there is a very tiny story of unintended consequences. It's not the only example of where the creation of the network brings challenges that might not have been envisioned right up front. Because the network was built, and I'm talking about not distinguishing between the ARPANET and the later Internet, and I'll come back to the distinction in a second, because it was built in a controlled environment, in the sense that all the funding came from one place, in a principally academic environment, there was a certain sense of restraint about what this network could be used for. Certainly could not be used for commercial activity. One person made the mistake of sending out a message to a large number of people telling about a job opening, and he instantly was informed by many people that that was an inappropriate thing to do. When we started using the network for email and for mailing lists associated with interest groups, they were predominantly related to the technology, but somebody decided that there were a lot of people on the network who were interested in science fiction. And all of a sudden there was a science fiction list, and immediately a heavy discussion about whether this was an appropriate use of this new medium, whether it was permissible to discuss science fiction stories on the ARPANET. We've come a long way from there, quite obviously. Now we have much more important issues. We have Hollywood stars that we track instantly. We have political parties that are campaigning over the internet, and it is infecting and affecting and perhaps even perfecting all of our social institutions and government institutions. Let me touch back at the creation of the internet per se. One of the other reactions, if you will, to the creation of the ARPANET was other governments said, this is now important. We see that the U.S. has a network. We, too, must have a network. I met with Canadians, with British, and with French network developers, all of whom were eager to have their own network. And I was particularly intrigued by the Canadians, who put together a project to connect Canadian universities. Now, the geography in Canada has its own challenges. Most of the population in Canada lives on the southern border, which is the northern border of the U.S., and there are vast reaches of very lightly inhabited land up to the north. Further, the population along the southern border is bunched very much in big cities, and those big cities are such as Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal, which is not exactly along the border, are relatively close to U.S. cities and relatively far from each other. From a purely engineering point of view, the simplest way to connect up those cities would be to connect them to their nearest U.S. neighbor and sort of graft them onto the U.S. network. Not a good idea from the Canadians' point of view. And they actually had a slogan that they wanted their data to travel east-west, not north-south. And so the political aspects of networking were present from the very beginning. Other elements of interneting came about from the creation of alternate technologies, the use of packet radio, the use of packet satellite. How do you build networks appropriate to those technologies and then interconnect them? And then even within the U.S. government, there was competition among different agencies, the Space Agency, NASA, the Energy Department, the Department of Energy, both built their own networks. The National Science Foundation eventually built a network to serve universities around the country beyond the ones that DARPA was supporting. And the issue was how do you interconnect all of those? And out of that was born the next iteration in the basic idea of networking, which was how do you have independent administrations of networks and still permit them to interconnect. And thus was born the IP protocol and the replacement for our original circuit-oriented, stream-oriented protocol, and then the replacement was called TCP, and that combination of TCP and IP with not a little bit of struggle, with quite a bit of struggle, eventually won the day and became prevalent around the world. Let me close with a mention of the consequences later in time. I mentioned the IETF evolving out of the original network working group. Many other institutions developed over time. The Internet Society was formed in 1992. The regional Internet registries, including the one that serves the Asia-Pacific region, APNIC, were formed to allocate address space across the network. 5 of them now exist. And, of course, most importantly, when the domain name system was created, it led to the creation of a country code for every country, with .th, of course, being for Thailand, and the creation of a country code top-level domain operation for each country. And THNIC is one of the crown jewels, one of the exemplary operations that arose out of that process. And along the way, somewhat later in the game, as it turned out, the organization that I now spend a lot of time with, ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, was formed to provide a formal structure and a house for overseeing the allocation of addresses and other unique identifiers, and of course also the domain name system. The creation of any institution brings with it an awful lot of challenges. Many people come to these institutions very concerned about what the rules are. And one of the things that we learned, I think quite well in the early days of the networking is first get the work done and then organize, rather than try to organize and set a bunch of rules and find out that you're never getting any work done at all. The pendulum has moved quite a bit. We now form organizations and spend an enormous amount of time haggling about what the rules are. And occasionally, we even get some work done, although I hesitate to try to measure how much work we get done compared to the number of rules that we write. Nonetheless, the network continues to evolve. We're now into an estimate of 2 to 3 billion people around the globe using the network, and in a sense, we're talking about how to get the other half of humanity connected up and using the system. I gave a talk yesterday, and one of the predictions which I'm fond of making when I'm asked what's going to happen in the future is I think that the internet will become so prevalent and so embedded that our language will change. We'll stop talking about being on the internet. We'll stop talking about the internet as a explicit thing that is in our conscious. It will be submerged. It will be, to borrow the Intel phrase, it'll be internet inside, and we will be focused on quite different things. I need to say a few very strong words in favor of THNIC and Kanchana and Pendry. The work that has been done at THNIC is really quite phenomenal and has been done quietly but very effectively. One of the areas that I'm very concerned about is network security, and in particular the security extension for DNS called DNSSEC. THNIC is distinguished in being the first to have implemented DNSSEC in Asia. That is a permanent place in my Hall of Fame for important moments and important milestones in improving the network. And it is at least in part for that reason that I was very pleased to accept the kind invitation to come here and to be with you today, and to be with you in the sense of being with friends and being with colleagues who've helped build this network, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crocker, for the speech. May I now invite Dr. Kotom to give token of appreciation to Dr. Crocker.